Ladies and gentlemen, we wish to welcome you to the second annual conference of the Baker Institute at Rice University. Allow me to also commend all of you who have risen so early this morning to listen to our distinguished keynote speaker. I actually thought the campaign was over. After Mr. Kemp has delivered his remarks, he will take written questions from the floor. Please raise your hand during the course of the morning, and an usher will collect your questions. It is now my pleasure to ask James A. Baker III, the 61st Secretary of State, the 67th Secretary of Treasury, and the Honorary Chairman of the Baker Institute, to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker. Mr. Baker.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ed, and welcome to everyone this morning. It's a real pleasure for me to have the opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker. He's an individual with whom I have been privileged to work in one capacity or another for 12 years during the Reagan and Bush administrations, and he's a person that I've had the honor of knowing as a friend for over 20 years. It's no secret that Jack and I have not always agreed on everything, but when we've disagreed, we have disagreed agreeably. And I think that Jack would agree that those disagreements have never destroyed our feelings of great respect and friendship for one another. But there's one thing on which Jack and I have always agreed, and that is that each of us married above ourselves. And Jack's wife, Joanne, is here today, as is her close friend, Susan Baker, and I would like for both of them to stand and say hello to everyone. Now, I'm going to spare you the details of Jack Kemp's CV. Suffice it to say, though, it is one of the most impressive in American public life today. Of course, he has been a longtime congressman from New York. He's been Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and most recently, of course, Republican nominee for Vice President of the United States. But I think a lot more impressive than what Jack has done, perhaps, is how he has done it. He has done it with unwavering fervor. He has done it with a passionate conviction. He has done it, indeed, with a human touch that has earned him the affection of even those with whom he disagrees. Over the last few months, America has had a chance to see our speaker close up. And of course, America has seen something that many of us have known for a long time, and that is that he is a good Republican. But America has also seen that he is a good citizen. He's someone who can put partisanship aside when that is called for in the service of the common good. More to the point, he is perhaps our nation's leading spokesman on the whole issue of tax reform. You might disagree with his views, but no one can deny his deep expertise on this subject. And no one can deny his personal commitment either to an America of individual initiative, of community empowerment, and of national optimism. Ladies and gentlemen, a great American, Jack Kemp.
Thank you. Thank you. What an honor to be introduced by such a good friend as Jim Baker, to see this wonderful turnout at the Baker Institute and have an opportunity, Ed, to be with you again and your lovely wife, Francois. And thank you for giving me the honor of, I'm wired so I can walk around a little bit. I really do appreciate the invitation, particularly having lost a campaign for vice presidency. I knew I lost when the morning after the election I went out and sat in the back seat of my car for 5 minutes before I realized I didn't have a driver. Ignominious defeat. Nice to be introduced by Jim Baker as a former congressman, a former housing minister, a former football player. My grandson, who's 11, introduced me to his Sunday school class as a former very important public serpent. Now, of course, I can add a former next Vice President of the United States with that. I can't imagine a better time to be discussing domestic policy challenges here at the Baker Institute at Rice University. The Kemp family have the distinction of both father and son losing games in Rice Stadium. I was quarterback of the San Diego Chargers in 1962 when we lost to the Houston Oilers in Rice Stadium, and my youngest son, Jimmy, was a quarterback at Wake Forest and lost to Rice in Rice Stadium. So Kemps have quarterbacked two major defeats against football teams from Houston. I'm glad you had a chance to meet my wife, Joanne. And let me just say once again, I consider this to be one of the most exciting times in the history of the world. I can't imagine a better time for the Baker Institute to be discussing domestic policy, because it is domestic economic and political policy and social policy that will have an impact upon the rest of the world. Who could have imagined a few short years ago when Jim Baker and I was in the Congress, he was in the Reagan administration, but imagine a world in 1981 when Ronald Reagan went to Notre Dame University and said, we will not contain communism, we will transcend communism, we will not denounce it, we will simply dismiss it as a sad and bizarre chapter of history whose last pages are now being written. I must admit, I didn't see the last pages of the history of communism being written in 1981, and Jimmy, I don't know that you could have seen it, but vision, as you have suggested, is a bridge between the ideal and the real. And that's why I appreciate what Jim has done in his leadership, not only in government, but here at the Institute, to show young men and women, to show us all that there is a link, there is an inextricable link between pragmatism and idealism, that you can both be an idealist and a utilitarian simultaneously. And that is the purpose of this great institute, to build that bridge between the ideal, between the vision of the ideal, and our ability to reach real progress and prosperity. So today, as we think about America on the eve of the 21st century, it is an exciting world. B, we have to lead by example. C, there is no place and more important to lead than here domestically on the type of policies that can not only bring greater prosperity to the American people, but rising standard of livings and hope and opportunity, particularly to young men and women who've been left out of this great dream that all too often we as adults take for granted. So my remarks today will hopefully be both idealistic as well as realistic and help the Baker Institute discuss this bridge between ideal and real. John F. Kennedy in 1962 gave a speech at the New York Economic Club in which he outlined a new and rather radical proposal for tax policy. You are too young to remember this, but in 1962, when I was the quarterback of the San Diego Chargers and you were doing whatever it is in your life that was occupying you at that moment, the top tax rate in America was 91%, the corporate rate was 52%, the capital gains rate was 49%, and America had come out of a recession very, very slowly in the late 50s, early 60s, and John F. Kennedy pledged to get America moving again. The 1960 campaign was fought out over how to get America moving again. And Mr. Kennedy went to the New York Economic Club and he gave a famous speech in which he said, "It is a paradoxical truth that high tax rates cause low tax revenues, and the best way to get more revenue was to grow or expand the economy." I say radical because up until that time, the rates had never been cut either by a Democratic or a Republican president. They had been manipulated up and down over a space of about 40 years, having started in 1913 with a tax rate of 4%. In fact, the Congress tried to pass a constitutional amendment in 1914 to limit the top rate to 10. and it was turned down by the Congress because they thought if they passed a constitutional amendment to have a 10% income tax rate, that pretty soon the rate would go from 4 up to 10. No one, am I too close to my mic? It sounds like it's, and it was turned down because no one wanted the rate to even go up to 10. I won't bore you with the history of the 20th century in taxes, but they went from 4 up to 91. Admittedly, at a relatively high rate of income, but nonetheless, it was 91. Kennedy said we'd get more revenue by bringing the rates down. And it was not an experiment. There was empirical evidence to support his contention that at lower rates, you'd get more revenue because the economy would be bigger. He cut the rate from 91 to 71. Reagan then cut it to 50. And with Jim Baker as Secretary of Treasury, it went down to 28 by 1986. And we made a couple of mistakes. We let the capital gains rate go back up to 28 from 20 and left it unindexed. But that was part of the price we paid to make Dick Gebhardt and Bill Bradley part of the coalition to get tax reform in 1986. The point I want to make is it should be demonstrably self-evident to even the critics that you can get more revenue from a bigger economy than from a relatively smaller economy. And that's been the history of this country in the 20th century. Revenues went up, notwithstanding the attack on Ronald Reagan's tax policies. Revenues in 1981 were $290 billion from income taxes, and when he left office in 1989, there were over $550 billion. Notwithstanding the fact, again, that the Congress spent more than we took in, revenues climbed when the rates came down from 91 to 70 to 50, all the way down to 28 by 1986. Bob Dole and I contended that lowering the tax rates across the board, cutting the capital gain tax, indexing the capital gain tax, were extremely important economic tools, not only to expand the economy, but to create more jobs with a higher standard of living on the basic premise that the only real way to raise wages and standard of living of a people was to increase the amount of capital invested per capita. Let me say it again. The major premise of both the Reagan as well as what Kemp, Dole, Baker, and even Felix Royatin of Lazard Frere, who wrote in the Wall Street Journal on April 11th, that tax policy should not be used to redistribute wealth, it should be used to increase wealth, and government spending should be used to redistribute income to low-income people, not tax policy, because tax policy is a very inefficient tool in redistributing wealth because ultimately it hampers the creation of wealth. The reason I extend this premise a little bit is to make sure that you and I both could come to an agreement between the left and the right, Democrat and Republican, that no matter what our political philosophy is, the ultimate answer to poverty is to allow people to get access to capital. And that today there's a starvation of capital, particularly in our inner cities. And the only way, some of us believe, to get that capital unlocked and flowing into riskier enterprises, riskier businesses, riskier areas of the country is to unlock this vast source of capital. I do want to read a short paragraph from Felix Royatin's piece of April 11th, the Wall Street Journal. He said, higher growth requires a tax system that promotes growth as its main objective. It must encourage higher investment and savings, and this is not the case today. Today's tax system aims at a concept of fairness dictated by redistribution tables. Having traveled in Asia last summer with my wife Joanne, we were amazed at what's going on the Pacific Rim of Asia, China. From Beijing and Shanghai in the north, all the way down to Guangdong province and Guangzhou and Shenzhen in the south, across the mouth of the Pearl River Delta from Hong Kong, there is no tax on capital gains. Now, isn't it amazing that in communist China, Maoist China, Marxist China, they don't even tax capital gains? The point I want to make today is we not only tax it, we tax it twice. Once on the capital gain, ostensibly, and the other tax is on inflation. I went through my campaign trying to explain to people in California that if you bought a piece of property in 1980 for $100,000 and you sell it in 1996 for $160,000, the $160,000 in 1996 buys $100,000 in 1980, but the nominal gain of $60,000 is taxed on the capital gain at about $17,000. We are not taxing the gain from investment, we're taxing the nominal value of that investment, and that is immoral, it is confiscatory, and it's something upon which both Democrats and Republicans ought to agree that basic fairness requires that we index capital gains to take out the inflated value of that asset. That would take a tax liability of close to $2 trillion off the capital stock of America. People would be able to go through that capital gain tax gate, which is a voluntary tax, is it not? If you don't sell anything, you don't have to pay it. And what's happening in America today, I contend as a premise that people are using their assets to be collateralized. They can borrow against that asset. They can write off the interest of the borrowing on their taxes. So in effect, our tax code today is subsidizing debt and punishing equity ownership and basically the formation of capital. And it's not hurting the rich. It is hurting the poor because they are the ones who go without the jobs and the access to capital and credit. I'm on the board of Howard University with Colin Powell. We're the token Republicans on the board of Howard University. Howard, I think, is our nation's most prestigious black university. I'm very proud to serve on that board with Colin. We have a mutual friend on the board by the name of Earl Graves. Earl is the publisher of Black Enterprise magazine. He said something with which I have never, ever disagreed, nor have I ever forgotten. He said, when men and women of color, particularly men and women of African American descent, are truly to be liberated in America, truly to get their economic civil rights in America, they must be free not only to get a paycheck, but they must be free someday to issue the paycheck. They must not just be an employee, they must have the opportunity to be an employer, and they must not only have the right to stay in a public accommodation, they must have access to the capital and credit to own the public accommodation. I don't mean to turn civil rights into just an economic agenda, but without ownership, without entrepreneurship, without access to jobs and education and capital and credit, we will never have a full agenda for civil, human, equal rights in America, and it is to that I want to speak for just a moment. Number one, as I said, our tax code punishes investment and rewards debt. That must change. We could have a sales tax or a consumption tax, as will be discussed later today. I personally prefer the Hong Kong tax code. In Hong Kong, the top rate is 15%. I don't know that we could get it down to 15 just now. Everybody says, well, Kemp, what should the perfect rate of equilibrium be? I don't know. That'll come as a shock to Jimmy Baker that Jack Kemp says he doesn't know. But in peacetime, history basically suggests that it should not be higher than 25% at the very highest. Our tax rates today under President Clinton are at the federal level, 42%. There's a 39.6% income tax rate, and as you will hear later in the panel, the income limits on Medicare and Medicaid have been lifted, so it's about a 42% tax. State of Texas doesn't have an income tax, and I would urge you not to allow a state income tax. We live in Maryland, we have a 6% tax on top of the 42%. If you live in New York City, you pay 11% state income tax, a 6% city income tax. People in New York City are in a 56% marginal income tax rate. And there's a correlation between high tax rates and low revenues. What should we do? Some thoughts. First of all, the tax code is so complex, it is corrupted. It's cynical. It doesn't even raise enough revenue to do the job that we want a tax code to do. A tax code should raise revenue for legitimate spending by government. We can argue about what spending should be, but there should be no argument that the tax code should create an opportunity to develop the revenue necessary to finance everything from defense to education to roads and highways and the security of our country, plus make sure there's a safety net under which people are not allowed to fall while we're building a ladder of opportunity upon which all people can climb. Some thoughts. I, for one, have come to the conclusion that we should just tax income once, not 2, 3, 4, 5 times. Stop and think about this for just a moment. If you earn $1 of income and you spend it, i.e. consume, you pay only one income tax. If you save it, you pay twice. If you invest it, you pay a third time. All investment must come from after-tax income. So it's already been taxed once as ordinary income, twice as saving, a third time on investment. It's unindexed, which, as I said earlier, is a fourth tax. And when you die, the government confiscates your property in order, in many cases, to pay for the taxes, as someone would want to make sure they could leave a farm, a ranch, a business, a home to their children. It is confiscatory to tax that estate at 55%. So I've come to the conclusion that tax income once would be more efficient, just once. Tax it as ordinary income once, don't tax it twice. Don't double tax dividends, don't even tax capital gains. I would index it retrospectively as a down payment on a new tax code, but as we enter the 21st century, I think Ross Perot was right, I think Jimmy Carter was right, I think Bob Dole was right, I think Ronnie Reagan and Jim Baker were right, that our tax code needs to be repealed in toto, 83 years old, 7.5 million words, breeding corruption, cynicism, contradiction, and confusion. Replace the whole thing with a single rate. What that rate should be, I really don't know. I would say maybe start at 25. At least get it back to 28 where it was when we left it in 1986. I had fun on campuses from Denison to Notre Dame when students would say, well, what does history say about the tax rate? And I said, well, in Genesis 41:34, when Joseph was sold into slavery, he told Pharaoh, after interpreting the Pharaoh's dream, that, hey, Pharaoh, stupid, if you want to get your economy growing 7 fat years, cut the top rate down to a flat 20. Well, you've got to be able to read between the lines. But in Genesis 41:34, Pharaoh was told by Joseph at 19 years of age, tax up to 1/5. Now, whether it's 1/5 or 1/4, a lower rate would mean greater reward for risk taking. And I make the premise, or establish the premise of my remarks, which is that all wealth is created by increasing the rate of return on risk taking. I'm not talking gambling here. We're not talking about a casino. We're not talking about floating down the Mississippi and putting your money at risk in a gaming sense. The ultimate risk is to take your capital, your saving, your time, your energy, your talent, and put it at risk in a business. I don't care if it's Microsoft, which was started with a few $1,000s of capital by a dropout from Harvard University by the name of Bill Gates. Does it bother anybody that he's wealthy? Doesn't bother me a bit. Does it bother anybody that John Johnson, who was on welfare in 1946, his mother had about $400 or $500 of furniture. He collateralized it, got a bank from a South Chicago bank, and started a magazine called Negro Digest in 1946. Maybe you've heard of it. Ebony. He is the richest African American in America. He owns Ebony, Jet, and Essence. It doesn't bother me a bit that they got rich. What bothers me is that not anybody else can get rich on a tax code that punishes the investment of time, energy, and talent, excess time, energy, and talent into a new business. And that should be changed. And clearly, I believe that Felix is right on the left, and I happen to think that Baker and Kemp and others are right on the center right in suggesting that we have a tax code that is totally designed for one purpose, to maximize the creation of wealth, and then use spending to help the poor. whether it's through housing or education or job training or daycare. I would much rather subsidize people directly by spending government money, which is available to be seen in terms of an appropriation, and it can be monitored, rather than using a tax code that ends up trying to redistribute wealth and punishes the creation of wealth. One other thought. If you look around the world today, taxes and money are the two biggest problems that countries have. I don't know of I don't want to sound like an economic determinist, but I'm not sure there's a more serious problem in the world today than the combination of money and taxes. Russia, no currency and a tax rate at about 91% on investment in Moscow. There is your mafia. There is your underground economy. There is the crime of the Russian economy. That if you have a 28% income tax, a 28% Social Security tax, a 28% unemployment tax, a 28% VAT tax, the tax on earning $1 of income in Moscow is 91%. No one in the history of the world will produce income and have it taxed at 91%. They will go underground, and there is your manifestation of a criminal activity, i.e. the mafia. Sweden had a tax on Ingmar Bergman of 120%. I told that at Notre Dame. The young woman said, Mr. Kemp, that can't be true. How could someone be taxed 120%? Ingmar Bergman made a film in 1979 which pushed him over the limit, and they went back and taxed not only 100% of that film's income, they went back and taxed another 20% of his previous income. So what did he do? He moved to Monaco. Sweden lost Ingmar Bergman, they lost his tax revenue, and they lost his talent, and they ended up with a country that was really starved for the formation of capital. Punishing the rich never works. It doesn't end up punishing the rich. As I said earlier, it ends up punishing the poor who want a chance to get rich. Last thought about the inner cities. Our social problems in America's inner cities, to a large degree, are caused by a lack of opportunity for young men and young women to get the jobs subsequent to their education that will lead them to the type of hope and opportunity for which they will choose productive, gainful employment as opposed to the streets. It has nothing to do with color, has nothing to do with climate, has nothing to do with anything other than the fact that the unemployment rate in our nation's inner cities is so high. It is absolutely leading to the type of socially unproductive behavior that is now manifesting itself all too often from Los Angeles to Harlem. Thought. No capital gain tax in urban areas of America. None whatsoever on any man or woman willing to put their capital at risk in those areas. You can see where they are. Number two, there should be no tax on a welfare mother who takes a job. Right now, the highest tax in America is not paid by Bill Gates or by Jim Baker. It is paid by a welfare mother who takes a job. When she leaves welfare, the government takes away welfare and taxes her income, to the tune that in some cases it may be as high as over 100% of income. In other words, you have to earn twice as much of pre-tax income in the private sector to make up for the loss of welfare, health care, food stamps, etc. in welfare. An unemployed father that takes a job in the inner cities of America loses his unemployment insurance, and they tax his income. It is stupid, it is counterintuitive, counterproductive. Something radical needs to be done. And by radical, I don't mean right or left. Radical in Latin means getting back to the roots of something. And the root of our economy, the root of human behavior, is to reward productive human behavior higher than unproductive human behavior. It's kind of a radical idea. Lincoln had the idea of giving people 160 acres of land free and clear if they would own it and occupy it. Ladies and gentlemen, you don't need to tell people to improve that which they own. As soon as ownership takes place, something happens here and here. And that is the root of human progress, ownership and rewards for productive human behavior. So I close with my thought about tax policy. It impacts welfare. There should be no tax up to 180 to 190% of poverty for any man or woman willing to take a job. Number two, there should be enterprise zones, green lining in every formerly redlined ghetto and barrio in the United States of America. No capital gain tax, no tax on income, and no tax on investor that puts his or her savings at work in the equity, the debenture, or the stock of any minority enterprise in those areas. Fourthly, we ought to just literally repeal the whole tax code and start all over and have a new code with a single rate somewhere between 20 and 25 or phased in over a few years that does not double and triple and quadruple tax income. And finally, we have to stabilize our dollar, make sure that interest rates can come down. I'll close with my favorite New York Times editorial, that we must worry about people like Jack Kemp, who believe that we can double the rate of growth of the U.S. economy. Our economy is growing at 2.1. They said, doesn't Jack Kemp know that this economy, even in the golden days of Ronald Reagan, they should have said James Baker, or in the golden days of John F. Kennedy, the economy never grew faster than 3.9 or 4% at the maximum. Ask yourself, what would happen to the American economy at 4% growth? We would double the size of the American economy in 18 years. That means another $1.5 trillion of revenue with which to save Medicare. That means another 20 to 25 million new jobs. It means more capital invested per capita. Higher wages come from output productivity and investment. Say, well, Kemp, you're utopian. I'm not utopian. I don't think you can create a perfect society. I just think we can do a lot better than we're doing. In fact, I'll say this. I think it's immoral to think of the American economy on the edge of the 21st century stumbling into the 21st century at 2.1%, where unemployment in some of our nation's inner cities is approaching 40%, where people are left without jobs, where underemployment is a very serious social problem, where wages are stagnant. Close with my little postscript to this. When I was at HUD, a journalist from the Wall Street Journal by the name of Alex Kotlowitz went with me to Henry Horner Public Housing in Chicago. Alex wrote a book called There Are No Children Here. There are no children at Henry Horner Public Housing in Chicago. Those children have seen more social pathologies at 10 and 11 years old than you and I have seen in all the maturity of our years. Alex Kotlowitz asked a little boy, 11 years of age, what he wanted to be when he grew up. And the little boy at 11 said, if I grow up, I want to be a bus driver. If I grow up at 11, that is an impossibility in this country to have little boys and little girls saying, if I grow up, I want to be. We have to have a country in which any boy, any girl, of any color, any race, any background, says, when I grow up, I want to be a mezzo-soprano, or a master carpenter, or a school teacher, or an entrepreneur, or an engineer, or a pro football quarterback, or whatever his or her dreams are all about. And we can't do it with a country in which the affluent are doing well, but there are too many people with nothing being left behind. And the Good Shepherd in us reminds us we must move forward, but we can't afford to leave a single child of God behind. Thank you. Thank you. Questions? How do you do this, Ed?
We have several questions. One that you may have already answered. Do you really think that growth rates of 5% are really possible for the United States?
Do I think that growth of 5% is possible? I think it would be possible for a number of years. It couldn't be carried out ad infinitum, but our country can do a lot better than it's doing right now. It's hampered by regulations, too much litigation, and a tax system that punishes work, savings, investment, and risk-taking. So in my opinion, if we got our money, if money were sound and stable and predictable over time, which I think Alan Greenspan has done a good job of giving us a better monetary policy than we've had for a number of years, coupled with lower tax rates on capital and labor, with litigation reform and regulatory reform, I think this country easily could grow for 7 or 8 or 9 years at 4.5% to 5% per annum. That's the big debate. That is the big debate in America. Can our economy grow faster than it's growing today? I believe it can.
Do budget deficits really matter?
Pardon?
Do budget deficits really matter?
Do deficits matter? They matter because they're a manifestation of the problem. They are not, in my opinion, the cause of the problem. This is too complex or too controversial to spend much time on, but I would just remind the critics of Reagan, the critics of Kemp, the critics of Baker, the critics of the Supply Side School of Economics, that we financed World War II, and the debt and the deficits were probably 10 times higher than they are today. We financed them with 3% long-term interest rates. 3% long-term interest rates. Money matters, and it's money that lowers interest rates. Sound money lowers interest rates. My wife and I got married in I know when it was. 1958. Boy, she was just waiting for me. I played for the Chargers in '60, as I said before. We bought our first home in 1960 when John F. Kennedy was running for president as Richard Nixon. We bought our first home in Costa Mesa, California, on a 30-year fixed mortgage of 4.25%. When I went to the Bills, we bought a home for $150,000. That was 1963 or 4. We bought a $150,000 home. I was making $15,000 for the Buffalo Bills, 1964. $15,000. They thought I was overpaid. And I worried every night of my career, what would happen if I got cut or hurt and couldn't pay off that mortgage? Jim Kelly of the Buffalo Bills makes $5.9 million a year and has a $150,000 mortgage. Question, who has the most debt? I had more debt relative to my income than Jim Kelly. Debt and deficits have to be measured against a country's or a person or a business's ability to finance that debt. And in my opinion, we should focus more on expanding the size of the pie rather than on just narrowly balancing the budget through any means necessary, which is what President Clinton has announced he would do to David Brinkley on Sunday. That his first order of business is to balance the budget. That means he's going to keep taxes high, maybe give you a tax break to go to Rice University if you get B's and keep your shoes tucked neatly under your bed and follow what Washington, D.C. wants. Excuse me, I just couldn't resist the micromanaging of the tax code. Pretty soon we're going to have a tax code in which every decision will be made according to Washington, D.C. if you behave the way they want us to behave. That is my opinion, is what's wrong with tax policy, and we ought to just repeal the whole code and go to a flat-out single rate system, which is a low rate of taxation. Deficits matter, but not for the reason that President Clinton thinks they do.
What are your views on a national sales value-added tax?
I worry about a national sales tax because low-income people don't have enough income that's disposable, and if you have a sales tax, you'd have to exempt them on shelter, energy, clothing, food, and by the time you've exempted the poor from the sales or the consumption tax, you would end up with a rate that's too high on consumption. Consumption is the reward for production, and savings is consumption deferred into the future. So all the reward for production is either consumption now or consumption in the future. And if you punish consumption, you're going to take away the reward for production. I'm not saying that it wouldn't be better than what we have today. It probably would be. Maybe we could design one. My mind is open, but I like, as I said, at least the structure of the Hong Kong tax code the very best. A single rate, no double taxation of dividends, capital gains, or estate taxes, total depreciation of all investment in plant, machinery, equipment, and technology. Wow. With an exemption for the poor do not pay any tax in Hong Kong. And let me make one point about Steve Forbes. Steve Forbes came up with a pure flat tax. I am not for a pure flat tax, nor was Bob Dole. I believe that a pure flat tax would be a mistake because we ought to have interest on mortgages fully deductible and charitable contributions fully deductible, because Catholic Charities, United Jewish Appeal, United Way, Habitat for Humanity. How many of you are involved at all or know about Habitat for Humanity? Raise your hands. And this is unbelievable. I've been all over this country. I have never, Susan, seen so many people involved in Habitat. They are doing work in inner cities, helping people get access to rehabbed homes and new homes. And isn't it interesting that they own it? Not a single home is rehabbed or built that is not delivered to the recipient with the mortgage, with the keys, and the promise that sweat equity would then be put into somebody else's home. I think this is the most important thing going on. One of the most important things going on in social policy in America today is helping people own. In fact, I would privatize all the public housing in America overnight. You give people a place to own, I'll guarantee you, improvement begins instantaneously. So my problem with the sales tax is that it punishes people who need to consume. But my mind is open. Is that an oxymoron for Jack Kemp?
Your tax plan reduced the earned income tax credit to lower income Americans. Why?
My tax plan, the question was, our tax plan reduced the earned income tax credit to low income Americans. Why? That's not true. I believe the earned income tax credit, which is a tax credit against the payroll tax, is a very important way of reducing the tax burden on welfare mothers and unemployed fathers who take their first job. So there has to be some form of an EITC, earned income tax credit, to offset the payroll tax. It may be that we're going to be headed towards a system in which the payroll tax will be invested in private equity or some form or other. And wouldn't it be interesting to think that a working man or woman, as long as we guarantee Social Security to all those in the system and about ready to come in the system, if you could invest 2 or 3 percentage points of your payroll tax into equity as municipal pensions do and state teacher organizations pensions do, working men and women would have 3 to 4 times the rate of return on Social Security that they have today. My favorite woman of the year, excuse me for this parenthetical point, is a woman by the name of Annie Schreiber of New York City. She died about 3 months ago, I guess. She left $22 million to Yeshiva University. Did you hear about her? She bought Merck, Coca-Cola, and IBM in 1946. She was a waitress in a cafeteria, and she saved $4,000 in 1946, and she put it into Merck, IBM, and Coca-Cola, and she never sold because she said the capital gain tax was too high. It split 75 times. 3 stocks split 75 times. She left $4,000 investment, rolled over the course of 50 years. She left $22 million to Yeshiva University. The power of compounded rates of return is so phenomenal. If we could get our young people, young men and women, labor forces to think about owning their own pension, owning their own retirement, A, it's portable, B, they'd own it, C, they would get a much higher rate of return on that investment over time, and that would, as Chile has found out, to be a much better Social Security than one that is draining current generations for previous generations.
JFK argued that tax cuts in a recession would increase demand in the economy, and yet you only argue that it brings in more revenue. Why do you ignore this other variable in fiscal policy?
What other variable?
That tax cuts in a recession would increase demand in the economy.
JFK, I assume you're referring to John F. Kennedy, not me. Well,
I really didn't know,
I'm
so I
sorry.
just used the acronym.
My initials are JFK. Jack French Kemp. And my wife Jackie, Joanne, no. Kennedy had bifurcated reasons for supporting tax cuts. One was the Keynesian school that suggested that it would lead to more demand. But Kennedy and Doug Dillon, the Secretary of Treasury, who was a Republican in the tradition of James Baker, believed that it would increase investment. People were buying, at 70% income tax rates, people were buying tax-free municipal bonds. They were sending their capital offshore. So by lowering the rate on capital gains from 49 to 28, and cutting the capital gains rate, cutting the corporate rate from 54 to 46, and cutting the income tax rate from 91 to 70 and down to 50, our investment climate expanded. And I told Ross Perot and also Pat Buchanan, the answer to trade is not to punish Mexico or punish Asia or punish Africa or punish Europe. The answer to our trade problems is to make it more worthwhile to invest in America than to invest in offshore production. And if we change the regulatory litigation climate in America and had a zero capital gain tax for investing in America and a zero estate tax, you watch that money be repatriated around the world to come to the United States of America. That is the answer to Mr. Perot and Mr. Buchanan. America can compete with any nation in the world, as Jimmy Baker has pointed out many, many times. The answer is to change the rules and the regs in Washington, not to punish Mexico, Asia, Latin America, or our trading partners in Europe. And that is, I'm convinced, a way to get capital investing once again in the United States. So I think Kennedy was for both consumption and output. And I think it should be the people's choice, not driven by social policy.
Was this past election a repudiation of supply-side economics?
Well, the press will say that it is a repudiation of supply-side economics. Clearly, President Clinton ran conservatively. We elected a Republican House, a Republican Senate. I don't know that supply-side economics has ever been fully and adequately explained to the American people, but I don't think there's any consensus for raising taxes in the Congress. In fact, I think Bill Clinton may very well lower the capital gains rate. If he wants a tax cut to go to college, I would imagine the Republicans, Jimmy, may offer a cut in the capital gains rate down to 18 or 19. I don't think it's been fully explored. The experiment is still going on. I'll tell you this.
Let me volunteer a partial answer also, because I'm probably in a better position to answer a question about the repudiation of supply-side economics than Jack is. Jack's been a disciple of supply-side economics for a long, long time. I'm a reformed drunk when it comes to supply-side economics, because I'm one of the guys that helped coin the term voodoo economics back there in 1979 for George Bush. And Jack knows, because I've said this in speeches for a long, long time, including one honoring him in Washington, D.C. quite some time ago. We were wrong. I was there and saw supply-side economics work from 1983 to 1987 or 88. I was Secretary of the Treasury for much of that time, and what I saw as a consequence of the embrace of supply-side economics and the lowering of marginal tax rates from 70% to 28% was the longest sustained period of non-inflationary growth in the peacetime history of the United States of America, the creation of 20 million new jobs, the very thing Jack has been talking about, at the very same time that we took 6 million low-income Americans totally off of the tax rolls as a consequence of tax reform of 1986. Now, people will say, aha, but you exacerbated the deficit to do that. It was not tax and spend, it was borrow and spend. And my answer to that is that's baloney. The fact of the matter is we were unable to get the spending reductions that were called for in the Reagan economic program through the Congress because the Congress didn't see eye to eye with us on restraining spending. The fact of the matter is it was that both houses were dominated by members of the opposite party. But supply-side economics worked and worked very well. And during that period of time, from 1983 to 1988, we reduced the deficit of the United States as a percentage of GNP from 6.3% to 2.9%. So the deficit didn't balloon in that period. You wouldn't believe that if you went out and read a lot of the articles reporting on the period. So to some extent, to those people who don't believe in supply-side economics and didn't believe in it, it was a failure. To those of us who, like Jack, who's believed in it for a long, long time, and like myself, a late convert, it was that period of time from 1983 to 1988 was an outstanding success in terms of economic policy and economic growth in the United States at a time that deficits were in fact coming down. Excuse me, but
could I just add one little? That's really interesting because this is, I think, a fascinating statistic. Income tax revenues were higher when Ronald Reagan left office as a percent of our economy than they are today when the rates have been raised. Say it again. We got more income tax revenues at lower rates than we're getting from the higher rates introduced by President Clinton. Revenues as a percent of the economy were 8.9% of GNP when Ronald Reagan left office in '89. Today, after tax rates have gone from 28 up to 39.6, revenues have gone down to 8.1% of GNP. So we can get more revenue from lower rates is a contention of both Baker and Kemp. Yeah, Ed.
Do you accept the argument that a balanced budget amendment, which may require raising taxes in a recession when revenue is down, is a measure that would lead to economic ruin?
The question about a balanced budget is a fascinating one because it has been conservative dogma for a long time, and now President Clinton has adopted the idea that his highest order for the federal government is to balance the budget. I would just say all balanced budgets are not created equally. Richard Nixon balanced the budget in 1969 with a surtax and high taxes. He raised the capital gain tax from 28 to 49, and he raised a 10% surtax that Lyndon Johnson had put on during the Vietnam War temporarily. Nixon kept it on in 69 and 70, and then we balanced the budget, and the economy went over the cliff. John F. Kennedy balanced the budget in the early 1960s through a combination of lower tax rates and sound money, and unemployment went down to 3.1% by 1965, and the budget went into balance. So the only way to really balance a budget is through economic growth and a restraint on spending rather than raising taxes and slowing the economy.
3 last questions. Non-tax related. Do you believe that there should be monetary limits on soft money for election campaigns?
Yes, there should be no soft money in political campaigns, none whatsoever, not even from Indonesia. I couldn't resist. There should be no union money, no PAC money, no business money. Only individuals should be allowed to contribute, and their names ought to go on the front page of the Houston newspapers and the New York Times. Politics can be cleaned up by making everybody responsible for their actions. And if the voters elect somebody to office who's taking too much money from one individual, that's our fault, not the officials' fault. But get all the soft money, all the PAC money, all the union money. Political PACs in unions spent $39 million telling the American senior citizen they would lose Medicare if Bob Dole and Jack Kemp were elected president. And that is the phoniest political campaign in my adult lifetime, other than the one used against Barry Goldwater in 1964.
Please explain your position on affirmative action.
Affirmative action has been with us since Abraham Lincoln had the Homesteading Act and the Morrill Land Grant College Act and established the Freedmen's Bureau in 1864, I believe, right before his assassination. The Freedmen's Bureau was set up to give the freed African-American slave access to education. Out of that came Howard University and the historical black colleges. That's affirmative action based on need. So I believe in affirmative action based on need, not based on the color of someone's skin. I think privatization of public housing, welfare reform, enterprise zones, education, inclusion and a vigorous enforcement of the civil rights laws is the right way to pursue affirmative action, but it ought to be based on need, not based on race and ethnicity and gender and color.
I was torn on the last question. We've got two questions. Do you really believe in the gold standard? And the second question, which I'm going to ask you, are what are your plans? A run in 2000?
We are on a gold standard right now. It is a de facto gold standard conducted by the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Alan Greenspan, who is keeping his eye on the dollar price of gold and keeping it in the range of 380 from 375 to 385. And if you go back and look at the price of gold over the past 2 years, it has ranged between 375 and maybe 390. We're on a de facto gold price standard. That means that if he would absolutely say that we are going to link the dollar to the price of gold, that means interest rates would come down, in my opinion, another 200 basis points in long-term markets. But that is an issue for another day. What am I going to be doing in 2000? Keep tuned. Stay tuned. I said in my concession speech that I believe in ideas. I'm kind of very much like Jim Baker. I want to be active in the pursuit of ideas and advancing ideas. That's why I really wanted to come to the Baker Institute, because it is rapidly gaining recognition here and around the world as a place at Rice University. Hosted by UAD and sponsored by Jim and all of the men and women in this room to one extent or another, in which ideas can be discussed, debated, dissected, and advanced. And I don't think there's any future for America if we are not a nation based upon ideas and the replacement of bad ideas with good ideas. And I would just close by saying thanks to all of you. Thanks to you, Ed, for being our moderator. Thanks to Susan and Jimmy for their longtime friendship. And I would just close with my favorite story from my days at HUD. I was the one at HUD who got an opportunity to introduce Alice Fraser to the Queen of England. And I think of all the things I did in football, all the things I did in Congress, all of the fun I had with Kemp Roth and tax cuts, this is my favorite all-time metaphor for the type of an America that I would like to see. Alice Fraser is a 70-year-old then, when the Queen was here, probably 73, 74. She's a wonderful African-American woman living in Southeast Washington, D.C. And thanks to the Reagan administration, the Bush administration, public-private partnerships, churches, synagogues, labor, capital, Catholic, Protestant, Jews, everybody came together to privatize public housing in Southeast Washington, D.C. And it had been on, I think, 60 Minutes or one of the TV shows, I forget which, and the Queen of England saw the show, and she called the Bush administration, and she wanted a tour of Southeast Washington, D.C. to see what this public-private partnership had been able to accomplish. And of course, I was the housing minister in the Bush administration, so I got a chance to introduce Queen Elizabeth to the residents of Drake Place. It's now called Queens Way in Southeast Washington, D.C. It was the murder capital of D.C. There were more homicides in this neighborhood. There were more crime. There was more crime, more drugs, more social pathologies. And I'm not saying it created nirvana, but there is an absence of drugs, crime, and homicide in this wonderful part of the District of Columbia, where everybody owns modest little homes. The morning of the event was a beautiful day. Thousands of kids lined up to see the Queen. Big, long, black limousine pulls up. All the British bobbies jump out with their, whatever it was that they had in their Uzis or whatever. And everybody was cheering the Queen and Barbara Bush. And of course, there's no more popular American woman that I know of than Barbara Bush. And the Queen had never, ever shaken hands with commoners. The rules of protocol are that you don't shake hands with the Queen. You don't speak to her unless she speaks to you. And under no circumstances are you ever allowed to hug the Queen of England. I was in deep trouble immediately. I went, as she got out of her car, she walked up, and the front door, out of the front door comes Alice Fraser. She walks out on the front porch, and before the Queen could even get up the last step, Alice grabbed her around her shoulders and picked her up off her feet about that high. And that was the picture on the front page of every newspaper in the civilized world. And I was just standing there with my mouth open. And the press came in, and bless their hearts, they wanted to know why Alice Fraser had violated protocol. And she said, well, it was the American thing to do. Speaking for all of us, that's the American thing to do. We hug and kiss and shake hands and, grab people. And then she said, but I tell you this to the press, I wanted the Queen of England to see my palace. Now, according to Forbes magazine, the Queen owns 5 palaces. She's worth $12 billion. She pays less tax than Leona Helmsley. And here's a 71-year-old woman who's never owned a piece of property in her life saying, hey, Queen, welcome to my palace. The definition you see of a palace is not measured in acreage. It's measured in terms of that which empowers you directly, that which gives you ownership, dignity. We need a country in which every child of God has an opportunity to own something, an education, a savings, a job, an access to boundless opportunity to be what God meant him or her to be, not what Washington, D.C. wants us to be. That is the American dream. It's sweeping the globe. It's happening in South Africa to a large degree, thanks to Nelson Mandela. It's happening in Asia. It's happening in Russia. It's happening all over the world. But if it won't work here, how in the name of God can we say to the rest of the world that democracy and private property and the rule of law will work there? That's the challenge for America on the eve of the 21st century.
Thank you very much, Jack Kemp and Joanne, for coming and opening up the Baker Institute's second annual conference. Thank you very much.